Smadar is the co-founder of the Gun-Free Kitchen Tables, the first Israeli feminist gun control initiative, a board member of B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center on Human Rights in the OPT, and a former board member of, I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong, Zochrot, raising, thank you, awareness of the Palestinian Nakba amongst the Jewish Israeli public. Well, fantastic. Thank you. I'll stay quiet and please.
Okay, good evening. Thank you for that. I'm really happy to be with you here. And I'm going to discuss today the intersection of COVID, public health, politics, and civil rights in Israel during COVID. So in the last year and beyond that. So starting in March and with the first signs of the global pandemic, massive protests swept Israel's streets, highway bridges, and especially the front of the Prime Minister's residence on Balfour Street in Jerusalem. The protests are still going on, starting July 14th, which was termed the Bibi Stilia, so after the day of the Bastille. So starting July 14th and through the election in the end of March, there are weekly demonstrations going on in front of the Prime Minister's residence every Saturday evening. Simultaneously, demonstrations are taking place in various locations across Israel. The question I want to raise and start to answer is, how did the public health emergency that threatens everyone's health figure into protests against other political or around other political and social justice issues? How did people and social movements tackle the wide range of issues that have come up, and what are the possible effects of the current moment? So theoretically, my perspective to this topic would be the sociology of social movements. How do social movements form, act, and mobilize people? And I will use various visual materials to discuss both the background to the protests, how have these protests been taken on, especially during COVID, and to demonstrate the events and their meaning to the formation of social movement and struggles. So let me share my screen because, like I said, I have some visuals to share with you. Like I said, protests in Israel have been going on consecutively for over a year, and they are still not going away. They center around a political crisis that has led Israel to 4 rounds of elections in 2 years. The last one was held in March 23rd. I want to start us off and get us into the atmosphere by showing you a short video of a demonstration in front of the Prime Minister's residence that took place in January 12th. This is a demonstration that started at 6 a.m. In the morning on January 12th. It was a cold and dark morning, and this is the Facebook account of an activist called Orly Bar-Lev. I will show 2 short segments and then translate the Hebrew a little bit for you.
בוקר טוב למי שמצטרף אלינו לשידור החי. אנחנו במבזק חדשות הדמוקרטיה מיוחד מירושלים. הפגנת בוקר של קבוצת המפגינים נגד נתניהו. עכשיו רצים לכיוון בלפור. אנחנו יודעים כבר שיש כוחות משטרה באזור. אתם איתנו.
Okay, so what she was saying is, good morning. These are the news of democracy talking to you, and we are heading towards the Prime Minister's residence on this morning, and you are with us. We already know that there are police and military forces waiting for us there. So keep tuned. So I'll pass now to another point in this demonstration, and then let you hear it.
בוקר לראות 200 צופים. תודה לכל מי
Okay, there's more to see, but you don't understand the language. So let us move back to the presentation. So what they're saying is actually, this morning, the Prime Minister was supposed to stand trial, but he imposed a lockdown because he wanted to evade his trial. And this is why we're here to remind him that he should have been facing the court. And the song goes, Bibi, that's the nickname of the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, go away, we're starting a revolution. And we will not stop until you go away. And if on the Facebook page that I just showed you, there was already a comment by one of the people seeing that, commenting on the presence of police forces and military that you see in there. It's the border police saying, you know, Orly, she's talking to that, she's commenting to that woman. In checkpoints in the West Bank, we see this kind of police and military presence and weapons all the time. So for us, people who are there, this is nothing new. So as I said, the theoretical framework I'm using is that of the sociology of social movement. Sociologists provide us with a theoretical tool to understand social movements, framing and frame analysis. It was first suggested by the great sociologist Irving Goffman and developed in various contexts, specifically to understanding social movements. Framing is a cognitive and emotional process that people do as individuals and in organizations. A frame determines the meaning of a situation for the participants interacting within it, enabling individuals to locate, to perceive, and to identify and to label events or a situation, their interactions with it, and its place in the world at large. Frames are not a given for a particular situation. Actors reflectively and collectively constitute them as they struggle over the productions of ideas and meanings. So for example, the question whether the management of COVID is a political partisan issue or is it a public health issue is a question of framing. Likewise, the question whether immigration is an economic issue or a national security issue or a cultural issue is again a socially open question. Another example is, for example, is police violence a matter of race or is it a matter of law and order? So people debate that and they constitute their frames both as individuals and together. Framing is built on lived experiences. So social movements select some aspects of a perceived reality and make them more salient in such a way as to promote a particular problem definition, a causal interpretation, a moral evaluation, and a treatment recommendation. This is central to the understanding of a movement's self-definition, recruitment, and mobilization strategies. In order for frames to resonate with people, they have to be credible. They have to resonate with experiences. They have to be meaningful and culturally connected. What we see in Israel is that the protest is in many ways open-ended, that different frames are being debated openly between different actors in a very wide movement that has a master frame, but that master frame that I will come to in a few minutes is constantly contested by different social movements, and the protests have not settled on a single frame for its different components. Because there are so many social movements that are involved in what I'm going to talk about, I cannot even name them all for this short talk, so I will refer generally to people or to movements or to groups that are behind that. So the first conception around COVID in Israel was that it was a threat to democracy, or it was used to threat democratic rights and values. The wave of protests started in March 2020, the month when the extent of COVID-19 as a global health pandemic became clear and various social restrictions were put in place. In Israel, so this sign that you see from a demonstration writes dictatorship on this sign of the COVID virus. In Israel, the COVID crisis coincided with a political crisis. You can see in this photo how COVID is connected with the social movement and claimed to be a crisis of democracy. The political crisis was evident in 3 elections that took place before that moment. Protests against the prime minister actually started before COVID, but they were reshaped after COVID. In April 2019 and in September 2019, elections resulted in a stalemate when Netanyahu, whose party won the majority of seats, could not establish a government. This was partially due to the fact that Netanyahu is facing corruption indictments, and some parties would not form a coalition with him because of that. A third election was going to happen on March 2nd, 2020, so just before COVID hit us. During these elections on March 2nd, a major alternative party called Blue and White vowed to defeat Netanyahu and never form a government with him. They won almost the same number of seats as he did. They won 33 and he won 36. And negotiations on forming a government started right away and were going on as COVID started. And at the same time, Netanyahu's trial was set to begin on March 17th. In the beginning of March 2020, then Israel was already in a political crisis. And we want to see what happened when COVID was added into this boiling pot. So around this date, COVID lockdowns started to be imposed. Prime Minister Netanyahu ordered the first lockdown on March 15th, which was 2 days before his trial. He asked the court to postpone his trial due to COVID. He was refused, and then he imposed the lockdown. So, and the trial was rescheduled for May due to the lockdown because of COVID. In April, the chair of Blue and White, who vowed to never allow Netanyahu to form another government, relied on COVID in order to justify his change of course. So he agreed to form a government with Netanyahu on the pretext that they needed to join forces in order to face COVID. And this was seen by many of his supporters or their supporters as a betrayal of their promise to the voters that voted to defeat Netanyahu and not to join with him. And the agreement between the parties gave Netanyahu a veto over the appointment of the Attorney General and the Director of Public Prosecutions. So I think you can understand how, due to this event, COVID was perceived as a pretext that was used to salvage a corrupt prime minister who previously reached a dead end, and provided him with a new government and with additional government powers to divert the judicial process against him. And this was perceived then as a threat to democracy, to the will of the voters. Now I want to see, how did COVID affect the protests? So after the lockdown was imposed, there were specific limitations on people's movement and on demonstrations also specifically. So people organized convoys of cars, which you can see in the slides. The convoys were a way to bypass the COVID restrictions. The restrictions of COVID triggered creativity within demonstrations. So this convoy is on March 19, right after the first lockdown was declared. The organizers' thinking was that if physical demonstrations can be outlawed for physical distance between people, they can protest with their cars. So this is the first example. A second example is this mass demonstration that took place in April 18, 2020. You can see that people are standing 6 feet apart from each other. So that was organized again to abide with the COVID regulations. And it's, you know, it's like, it looks like a military, right? Military parade, but it was very specifically designed for that reason. But as you saw in the video, it didn't keep on looking like that. Israel has a very long tradition of using emergency regulations, and those have an immediate effect, legal effect over the entire state, and also using law enforcement agency to actually enforce these restrictions on people. So people were cited by police forces, and sometimes border police was using them for not wearing masks or for being out when they were supposed not to be in masks. Being outside when they were not supposed to be outside. So there was a lot of preoccupation with complying with these limitations that were set by the government, and demonstrations became harder to organize, but were still going on. Another way of putting up with these restrictions were demonstrations on bridges. So protests developed around COVID restrictions and around the ongoing sustained nature of the demonstrations. People developed a decentralized form of protesting weekly on highway bridges and in central junctions in places that were outdoors, close to home, and with high visibility to nearby traffic. It was also an opportunity for many people to meet each other despite lockdowns. Another form of demonstrations were curbside protests. So at a certain point, the government restricted the distance that people could be from their homes. So you could not be, it was not allowed for you to be in a distance of over 1 kilometer from your home. And this was also perceived and was an attempt to limit demonstrations and people moving in order to reach the places where they protested. So people started protesting on the curbside, just in front of their houses, in order to bypass that. And you see these people. Another thing you see in this photo is that these are very old people. So the people in these photos are over 90 years old. And so this was a really cross-generational type of protest. People participated from every part and segment of society, including very old people that would not necessarily come to demonstrations. So I want to now turn to the symbols and the framing of the protests. So the main two symbols that you could also see in the previous photos were the black flag and the national flag of Israel. So the black flag stood for a warning sign, and that was needed because there was a danger to democracy, which was embodied by the prime minister and his corruption. And the national flag meant that people were not contesting the national framework of Israel as a democracy and as a Jewish state, but representing the people and representing the national interest. So we have a democracy and we will not let you, the prime minister, to rob it away from us. Because COVID restrictions suppressed democratic rights, like the right to protest and the freedom of movement, they figured into the frame of the fight to democracy, for democracy. The main logo of the movement, you see here on the left side, it's in Hebrew, but it says leave, go away. So this is directed at the prime minister, and the logo form is taken from what you see on the right hand, which is the logo of the Likud party, the prime minister party. So the same shape of the letter, it refers to, it means to symbolize that it refers to the prime minister, leave and go away. But this main frame was soon started to be contested. So in the next slide, you see here, you see the T-shirt with the logo of, leave, go away. But on the left-hand side, you see, a few letters in pink. So the letters in pink say come, but in a female form. Okay, in Hebrew is a gendered language, so the verbs are different if you are saying them in the masculine or in the feminine. So come in the female form and in pink suggested that problems of democracy and government were also connected to the highly masculine control of power, that there was not enough representation for women in politics. The female form and the pink represented a female gender presence and voice. Additionally, the call come contested the negative form of leave, saying that the protest should not only be against the prime minister, but also have a positive aspect. What do we want to come instead? And it suggested that what we want instead is a female leadership. A similar protest or contestation was coming from queer movements that really used the pink power, the pink color even more. Pink became a very powerful color in the demonstrations that also produced the national flag of Israel in pink, something that was never done before. That was a contestation of the type of democracy that we want and suggesting that other forms of patriotism that need not be masculine, militaristic, and nationalistic exist and have a place within the demonstrations. Other logos are saying investigate now, and you can see the proliferation of logos. So the one on the left with a symbol of a submarine related to another corruption accusation against the prime minister that he made a submarine deal with Germany to purchase submarines that was somehow corrupt and that was under investigation. This was the first one, but right after that, another investigate now logo or symbol came out with the sign of COVID. So that demand was to investigate the way the government had managed COVID. So it was taken from the realm of political corruption into the realm of COVID management. So these were the broader frames of the protest, the frames of a threat to democracy and some contestations of it. Sociologists of collective action framing also tell us that not all frames are created equal. The larger range of problems covered by the frame, the larger the range of social groups that can be addressed with the frame, and the greater the mobilization capacity of that frame. Only when various problems could be plausibly connected with one another, they can succeed in generating a master frame. And we've seen that democracy succeeded in framing many, many issues into that framework. So master frames functions if they are socially and culturally resonant with their milieus. Some frames, however, are narrower than others, and we're gonna see them right now. So these photos symbolize two different frames. So the one on the left, Bibi Go Home, resonates with a master frame of corruption and the prime minister. The other sign on the right reads, it doesn't matter who the prime minister is in an apartheid state. So this sign contests even the presumption of the democracy struggle that there is a democracy in Israel. And if that is the case, what is there to defend if there's no democracy but apartheid? It suggests that the entire focus on replacing the prime minister is misguided because what needs to be replaced is the entire form of regime. Another thing to note here is that the sign is speaking to other demonstrators, to the dominant framing of the protest, and not to the government. So it is challenging the framework of the protest as a protest for democracy. It is a conversation among demonstrators, and while it challenges the protest, it still takes place within it. So there's an internal conversation. This is a narrower frame because the argument of apartheid concerns only the treatment of Palestinians and speaks to a narrower segment of the population than the ones protesting for democracy. This argument that Israel actually is imposing an apartheid was amplified in the last couple of months since these demonstrations by leading human rights NGOs such as B'Tselem, which is an Israeli NGO, and only 3 days ago, Human Rights Watch published a report saying that Israel had crossed the threshold to apartheid. And these reports have resonated today much more than they have resonated in the past. So I cannot trace that exactly to COVID, but that's a hypothesis that should be tested, whether these demonstrations somehow were able to crack the understanding of Israel as a democracy. Other narrower frames that appeared during the demonstrations one of them were police violence. So around the same period, there have been several police killings. The most well-known of that was of Iyad Halak, a Palestinian resident of East Jerusalem on the autism spectrum, who was shot by the border police when walking from his home to his institution. This sparked additional protests, but these protests also raised other cases of police violence, such as that of Solomon Taka, an Israeli Jewish citizen of Ethiopian descent, and Shirel Chavura, a mentally disabled Mizrahi Jewish citizen. So these two are from marginalized communities within the Israeli public, who were both killed by the police. And the posters protests raised this issue by demanding justice for Iyad, justice for Solomon, and justice for Shirel on street graffitis, t-shirts, calls and demonstrations, and signs. And they were connecting all these cases in a frame of intersectional racial justice. This frame was also narrower, but was made broader by its intersectionality and solidarity of struggles between these three marginalized groups. Other alternative struggles were also taking place. This is all inside the big demonstrations. So these are more intersectional alternative struggles that have gained traction during the protest, proposing joint struggles of Jews and Palestinians. You see here in Hebrew, in Arabic, and in English, calling for racial justice. The person on the right top photo, what's written on his t-shirt is Black Panther. So these struggles also resonate with the democracy framework, but suggest a more radical critique of the racial policies of the government, challenging the argument that as a Jewish state, Israel can still maintain equal treatment for all the groups, including non-Jewish groups and other racialized groups. Other protests has been going on, and now we move to slightly different protests because these were not taking place within the general protests in front of the Prime Minister's residence and with the Black flags. So we can see here two photos of two groups that did not join the carnival but held their own protests. On the right-hand side, it's a protest of Palestinian citizens of Israel against the neglect of crime and gun violence in their societies and the neglect by the police and the government to address these issues. And on the left-hand side, you see a protest by ultra-Orthodox Jews who were protesting against COVID restrictions that interfered with their religious and cultural practices, like praying together in synagogues and gathering. So these communities really both violated and protested against the COVID restrictions, but under a totally different framework of their religious practices. And they don't even accept the authority of the state because their only allegiance is to God and to the Jewish religion. Other forms of frames gained traction during protests. So as protests were going on. So we saw police violence earlier, now police violence was happening in the demonstrations. So you see on the right-hand side, the photo that became very famous of a demonstrator who was being sprayed by water while holding the national flag. And this guy, it was the first demonstration he ever went to in his life. He was interviewed later, and it just was the first opportunity for many people who never experienced police violence and state violence, experienced that during the protests. So you see on the left-hand side, this photo was made into a statue by an artist, Itai Zlait, and it was placed in a very big square in Jerusalem in front of the Jerusalem municipality without a permit, and it was removed only a day after it was placed there. It was called Israeli Hero. Other issues were added again during the protests and as COVID management went on. So Israel experienced its own Snowden moment, like it was called in the article that I sent you by Amir Kahana. So the Israeli government used surveillance techniques by the Israeli security service that were previously used only against Palestinians and in criminal cases to enforce COVID quarantines. So people started getting text messages into their cell phones saying, you have been detected as someone who were in contact with COVID, someone who tested positive for COVID, and therefore you need to self-quarantine. And that was the first time that many people in Israel have experienced the vast surveillance abilities of the government that they have never experienced before. So Palestinians and people who support the Palestinian struggles have long known of these surveillance techniques. Palestinians are prosecuted in military courts for posting on Facebook. People who post or send messages in this context are being approached by police and law enforcement, but the big majority of citizens have never experienced that. And many of these text messages were wrong. So they're wrong in locating people, and people experience not only how much the government knew about them, but how mistakes can be made with these surveillance techniques. Several NGOs have taken these policies to the Israeli Supreme Court and petitioned against them, which you can see in the photo on the right bottom side. And this has made this issue more publicly visible. So the discussions in the court, the legislative procedures around these powers were all covered in the media. And so many people were exposed to them, even if they didn't get the text messages to their phones, by learning about them from the media. And it was a really strong demonstration of how government powers can be used against ordinary citizens. So because COVID was threatening everyone's health, the toolkit or the repertoire of government powers that were previously used only on marginalized groups the government started using them against everyone, so everyone were exposed to them. So the last issue that the protests touched on were vaccine policies. So Israel acquired a large number of vaccines early on, and it has a very good public health system that enabled the vaccine rollout to be very effective. And people were encouraged to get vaccinated at an early stage. But there were two issues around vaccines. So on the left-hand side, you see protests of anti-vaxxers who frame the vaccine as government intervention with their freedom and protest that. So that's kind of a libertarian point of view that we get in many other places. On the right-hand side, you see a protest that is specific to Israel, and that is around the vaccination of Palestinians. So the argument was that the vaccines policy neglects Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories who are not Israeli citizens, but are still subject to Israeli control, and they are not being provided with vaccines. And some people have called that vaccine apartheid. So you can see that these are two quite lonely women standing in front of a vaccination station. This did not turn into a massive movement, but it still formed part of protests that came up in the context of COVID. So to conclude what we have seen, Israel has experienced an unprecedented wave of multi-generational and cross-sector protests, and it is in a constant process of collective action framing. COVID management by the government figured into an existing political crisis, empowering an already controversial prime minister. Additional government measures addressing both COVID and massive protests created distrust of government management of COVID and further mobilized the protests. The protests operate under a master frame of defending democracy, while narrower social justice frames are being taken on. Some contest the master frame, while others seek to join it. And government actions relating to both COVID and the protests apply to the majority communities the repertoire of coercive measures that are usually applied to marginalized communities, exposing many Israelis to coercive aspects of government and law enforcement for the first time, changing their experience of government power and potentially the framing of their positions. So the protests are still going on. And you can see, I made this presentation in February, but I followed up a little bit. People in these protests that are mainstream Israelis are being arrested, are being taken to court, their access to the location of the protests is being limited. Their ability to contact other people that are demonstrating is being limited. And this has been happening for years with Palestinians. It's the first time that it's happening with Israelis. And people are saying things like, we are just a few steps before they start to apply administrative detention, which is a form of preventive detention that is used against Palestinians, saying this is coming to us now. So people are gaining through these protests a new social understanding of what the government does, and potentially they could frame their social struggles and political struggles differently after that. This is still to be seen.